Congresswoman from District 18.
I mean, I think the first priority is addressing healthcare issues in our country. And it's not just on the insurance side. I mean, we can talk about the Affordable Care Act, and I believe that healthcare is a right. We should be moving to single-payer healthcare. But what we really need to address is that healthcare is not a market like sneakers or TVs. You don't have a bargaining position when you're desperately in need of medical care or a certain kind of pharmaceutical. And that desperation leads people to have to pay more and more for our pharmaceuticals, maintenance, and even things like preventative care. What we need to do is address the fact that many pharmaceuticals are pricing medications with no correlation to actual cost. And absolutely out of control profits, and the consumers are stuck in the middle having to pay way more for these products than they should.
Ms. Keith, your opponent, Ms. Baer, last week talked about the need for more universalized health care, stopped short when I talked about single payer, said wanted to look at the dynamics, but certainly extending the reach of the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. And she worked under the Obama administration. Your presumptive opponent, should you get past her in the primary, Mr. Mast, of course, does not believe and has said, listen, ACA hasn't really worked. It's too costly. A lot of people were told you can keep your insurance if you want to. They couldn't. A lot of people being priced out of the marketplace. How do you speak to those kind of critiques of the ACA?
Well, I think the first thing we have to admit is that Mr. Mast and the Republican Party's option to Obamacare is no care. Right? You just are on your own, and you get the health care you can afford, and if you can't afford that, then you get nothing. To me, that is not only an illogical position, it's an unpatriotic one, because people die prematurely when their medical situations are not handled.
So how do you address the fair critiques, which even back in the Obama administration, they admitted it's not rolling out the way we thought. They've tweaked it a lot since then. How do you address the critiques between those who hold the position Mr. Mast does, all the way over to single payer, which even the Obama administration would not touch? They thought single payer was a rail of politics they could not go to. You're sitting here saying you want to go there. How do you address the criticisms, though, and find some middle ground from where you want to be to where your opponents are?
Well, the first thing we have to understand is that a lot of that critique about the aspects of the Affordable Care Act that don't work are by the people that created those aspects to not work. The sabotage of the Affordable Care Act was really the top priority of the GOP. So for them to turn around and say, oh, look how it's not working, without owning the fact that they're the ones making it not work, is a problem. I think moving towards single payer, Mike, is really about efficiencies in the system. Every employer out there now has to be a healthcare provider. And that is not just duplication of effort, that's multiplication of effort.
Certainly Democrats on the Hill, some of them talking about that. It would put you more in the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. More centrist Democrats don't want to say the word single payer. Do you worry too liberal of you for the race you're running and the place you're running?
I don't think liberal or centrist or conservative is the right question. I think the question is, do you have a solution that actually works for the American people?
You talked about other key ideas.
Yes.
What are the other things that, if you had to say, in my first 6 months to a year, these are the one or two things I tackle? You talked healthcare. What's the other?
There's two others that I'm really concerned about. First is gun reform. I believe in the Second Amendment rights, but I also believe that we can make much smarter gun policy. What I'm advocating, Mike, is that every gun owner should carry liability insurance. The process of purchasing liability insurance is the process of risk assessment. So if you are a smart, safe gun owner, your insurance probably would be very low, just like a smart, safe driver. But that risk assessment process allows a company to look into a background and decide, hey, is this too risky for the greater population? Right now, the kids in Parkland that were injured, or some of them are still in hospitals, some parents are paying out of pocket for their care. If those kids had gotten hit by a car, who would pay for that?
What about the argument that many will make, who will say it begins to impinge on my Second Amendment rights, and don't go there?
Right. I would say that there is no right in the Constitution that doesn't come with responsibilities. And that being required to carry insurance doesn't stop you from having a gun, but it makes sure that the risk of that is not borne by the public.
And to Parkland, you've been very clear about your feeling on assault weapons. You would like to see them banned. In fact, Congressman Mast, the Republican incumbent, has said that as well, as does your opponent. Talk about that, and talk about the criticism some in our audience will have to say we're focusing on the wrong things. We need to focus much more on violence, on red flags, on mental health, on restraining orders for those who have mental illness, not on taking guns away, when largely the argument goes you'd be taking away from law-abiding people. You feel differently when it comes to assault weapons.
I absolutely do. Assault weapons have no defensive capacity. They are assault weapons are designed for weapons of war. They don't belong on civilian streets. They don't.
You and Mr. Master on the same page there.
We agree on that, and I'm glad that Brian took that position. But I'd also say this: when a party says, let's talk about mental health, but every time we try to cover mental health and insurance plans, they're not interested. Every time we have mental health professionals in schools, they're not interested. Every time we talk about preventative psychiatric care, they're not interested. I think you have to be careful when every time we talk about guns, they want to talk about mental health, but every time we talk about mental health, they don't want to talk about that.
I want to talk to you about a few other topics, then the politics of the campaign that you're running and some of the hurdles that you face, because your opponent's getting some high-profile backers. But let's shelve that for just a moment. Brightline, you know about the controversy in the Treasure Coast. Where do you stand on Brightline?
I was always against it because it never made any sense for those trains to be coming through Martin and St. Lucie counties. If the goal is to move people from Miami to Orlando, it makes no sense to have them coming through St. Lucie County. And quite frankly, what we're seeing is that this kind of was a bit of a bamboozlement. At
this point, do you think it can really be stopped? It's already open for business in the southern tier counties, and part of the piece of the totality of that, so we've got to move it to Orlando. At this point, what really effectively can be done?
Well, I always believe in the
power. Or should be done. Some argue we need more mass transportation. Some say we do need this.
We do
Many
need,
say it.
Yeah, I don't disagree with the notion that we need more mass transportation. But a transportation system that doesn't even have a stop in Martin or St. Lucie County for people to get on the train is not a method of moving people through Martin and St. Lucie counties.
How can you do a better job if you were to go in as a freshman congresswoman than Brian Mast, let's say, when it comes to the toxic algae crisis, still haunted by that on the Treasure Coast, building a reservoir south of the lake, trying to move water instead of east and west south. A lot of controversy about how much more needs to be done, where we do it, how we do it without dislodging those in the agriculture industry, the sugar industry south of the lake, people who make their livelihoods generationally there. Where do you stand on what more needs to be done to get money from the feds for toxic algae cleanup, for new water reservoirs, and effectively, how can you do that as somebody who would be new to Congress more effectively than the incumbent?
Well, I think part of Brian's ineffectiveness is he's a small player on a team rowing in the wrong direction.
What's that?
In the sense that
pretty harsh critique.
Well, I think it's a fair one. I mean, let's be honest. The GOP has not taken environmental stewardship as a serious issue. And so even if Brian were to be taken at his word of caring about this issue, his party is gutting the EPA, and it's not taking environmental stewardship seriously at all. I think the difference between myself and Brian in terms of effectiveness is that the Democratic Party does believe in environmental stewardship. And I would be able to spearhead a team that is looking to make sure that the St. Lucie River and the Indian River Lagoon are protected.
Let me talk a little bit, if I may, about the campaign. There was one article that said you and Ms. Bear in many ways are very much alike on all the major issues. So why are you a better candidate than she for this Democratic electorate that will make its choice this summer to move on to the general election? What separates you from her?
It's not a question of what separates her and me philosophically. It's a question of which one of us can actually beat the incumbent. So the question is, who has the passion, the fire, the energy, who can drive out the vote, and who's a better matchup to Mr. Mast on a stage where we're going to have to debate the issues.
I know that the horse race and the campaign fundraising makes many in the political world cringe, say it's a long way out, but the fact of the matter is she's getting support from Democratic Party leaders. Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer was in town, about 3 times more in campaign contributions, which right, wrong, or indifference, the mother's milk of campaigns. How are you going to overcome that support she's getting? She worked for the Obama administration, getting that support, outpacing you on fundraising. What's your argument? How do you make your case that, listen, I may be the underdog financially, but I'm the one you need to look at in District 18?
Well, there's no question in my mind that Lauren Bear would be an excellent representative of Steny Hoyer. Or Nancy Pelosi. She lives exactly like they do. The question is, who's a great representative?
How do you mean that?
Well, she's lived in D.C. for years. She comes from a very wealthy family and is very much tied to the inner workings of the party. That's not the question that's being asked by Florida 18 voters. They want to know who represents them. And that's the person who lives like they do, the one who lives in the district, who has gone through some of the same struggles that they have, who maybe didn't have the advantages of wealth and access that Ms. Bear has, but understands the day-to-day struggles to maintain great schools, to make sure that your kids have great health care, to make sure that your parents have the senior care and the nursing facilities that they need. And of course, when we're talking about going head to head against a guy who served honorably in the Army and lost his legs and really sacrificed, it is really important that the Democrat also has served, that they have sacrificed for their country and can talk about those issues from a position of experience. There is a world of difference between empathy and experience. I can always empathize with what someone else has gone through, but it's very different when I can say, I've been through that myself.
I know in terms of healthcare, veterans care, importantly, we'll talk more about that as we get you back over the course of the summer, but it's a year of sea change. More women, record-breaking number of women around the country running for Congress. Talk about the larger issues in play in your mind in a country that's so polarized in many ways right now politically, and what's at stake in a bigger, more holistic way to you in the race, the midterm elections this year, from your perspective?
I think the bigger issue, the big elephant in the room, is what we're seeing out of Washington, D.C. in this administration. I've talked to independents, I've talked to Republicans, I've talked to many Americans who say, look, we may not agree on this particular policy, but we do believe in the separation of powers. We do believe in the rule of law. We do believe that the president shouldn't be lining his own pockets from his office. We do agree that the free press is necessary to a viable democracy. And when you watch those institutional attacks, those attacks on the things that have maintained our democracy for generations, then that's an area where everybody can come together and say, we are not going to let this happen to our country.
Ms. Keith, thank you for reintroducing yourself to our audience, and she's already promised she, like other candidates, will be back before the primary season. We will have Mr. Mast on in a few weeks' time and have you all back in yet again before the primary kicks into full gear as we move through the summer. But we thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. So great to be here.
Coming up,